Welcome to the World United. Welcome to the World United.
Alexander HAG Parkinson. Alexander considers himself a spiritual scientist, someone who has published scientific papers in world-class peer-reviewed journals, but someone who also recognizes that many things exist beyond the physical realm and outside of the boundaries of scientific explanation. His interest in spirituality and metaphysics started at the age of 17 when he witnessed demonic possession and a failed exorcism. Since then, and for the last 2 decades, he has been a student of applied metaphysics. Alexander has several degrees in archaeology and paleontology. In 2010, he established Soul Array Private Limited, Africa's largest historic spiritual online shop. In 2018, he launched Afrocentric Antiques, which provides museum quality African art to collectors, institutions, and enthusiasts. We welcome you, Alexander. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And good morning and good evening to anybody watching. And welcome to the World United Africa edition. It's an absolute honor for me to spend this time with you and to discuss the origins of consciousness in Africa and how this is clearly evident in the paleontological and archaeological record. I'll start in an area of South Africa that is called the Cradle of Humankind. And in the early 2000s, the United Nations and the World Heritage Society of UNESCO declared the Cradle of Humankind a World Heritage Site. And the reason for the declaration is the area is covered in dolomitic caves. And these caves preserve our human ancestors ranging from about 3 million years all the way up until the most recent discovery of about 200,000 years. Now, what is evidence from the paleontological or paleoanthropological record in Southern and in East Africa is that the origins of our species, the origins of our genus, the Homo genus, certainly evolved and originated in Africa. And you know, from the early turn of the 20th century, you have got huge amounts of research being dedicated to the discovery of our ancient descendants and our ancient ancestors. And in the last few years, I've been very fortunate to work with some of the very highly qualified professors in the region on the topic. And I've worked on several of the sites myself. Now, what's interesting is that Africa is the cradle of humankind. And whenever I give talks of this nature, I always say to people, you must always understand that we are all African. It doesn't make a difference whether you come from Asia or Asian descent or European descent or anywhere really. What is evidence in the paleontological record is that anatomically modern humans, as well as our earliest ancestors of the genus Homo, evolved in Africa. And that in itself is an amazing thing, because in consciousness, when we think about what is consciousness, in time, we all had some form of connection, whether it was in the formation of the universe. But what is clearly evident is that anything up to about the 2 million mark, the 1.5 million mark, we are all linked ancestrally to Africa. Now, when we consider these are not exactly us, they are not anatomically modern humans that are from South Africa. But when we consider that in East Africa, you have a 200,000-year-old anatomically modern human that originates in East Africa, what this shows is that from roundabout that mark, round about 200,000 years ago, we have anatomically modern humans, which means that the skeletal remains of these individuals look identical to us. So for 200,000 years, we have been on this planet and in our ecosystems. But interestingly enough, you know, if we consider, for example, Egypt, we have a few thousand years worth of historical record. And what is fascinating is what in the last 200,000 years, at what point do we start to become less animalistic, for want of a better word, and more human? You know, in other words, where does our consciousness come from? And one of the interesting things is that when we look at the archaeological record, there's certain things that make us human, that make us different from other species. And some of those things relate to the idea of consciousness, in that, for example, we are the only species in the world that undertakes art. You know, no other animal has an interest in art for art's sake. And another thing that would be interesting is that when you find the origins of art, when you find the developments of consciousness in the strictest sense, we also have developed a sense of God. You know, what is God? And when we've developed this consciousness, and I believe that the origins of the consciousness itself relates to when art appears in archaeological record. Now, around about 76,000 years ago in South Africa, at a place called Blombos Cave, you have some of the oldest engravings on a piece of ochre. And at about 60,000 years ago, we also have engravings on ostrich eggshells. And a lot of this is indicating that consciousness in itself, the idea of us stopping being merely animals and moving into a state of consciousness, or being conscious aware of what is God and what does he mean to us. And I think what is really clear is that Africa is the birthplace not only of our genus, but of our species, and also of anatomically or consciously modern behavior, in the form of the production of art, in the form of the use of complex stone tools. And all of these things are happening within the African continent. We are all Africans, and that my skin is white. And I might not appear to be an African, but in deep time and space, my origins are rooted in the African continent. And I think what is alarming to me is that it has almost become unpopular to be African, especially when it comes to belief systems. You know, if we consider the origins of sort of theology, or the origins of consciousness, a lot of the ancient belief systems were rooted in animism, which is really the idea that, you know, the oceans and the thunder and the trees and all of these things have energy, have God energy. And, you know, when we look at the animistic belief systems that are still within Africa, and we consider, for example, things like ancestor worship, and how the practices of ancestor worship has really fallen away. What is interesting is that as a modern analog in a Western world, the world has become sort of familiar, for want of a better word, with things like clairvoyance or mediums and people that contact spirit. And this is certainly not anything new. You know, there's records back to the 12th century of West Africa where you have certain population groups that have these clairvoyants and mediums, and they communicate with the ancestors of the people, whether it's for the purpose of clarity or for healing or whatever the case is. And you know, the Western world, for want of a better word, is becoming almost familiar with the role that our past ancestors have played in our life, and how they play an active role in our protection, in our guidance. You know, we now, in a sort of spiritualist context, we recognize that we have ancestor guardians. You know, we talk about our spiritual guardians, and all of these things are very much entities or past people that have existed in our family that are still attached to us. And, you know, unfortunately, in Africa itself, we've had this predominance of, or the overtaking of Christianity. the predominance of monotheistic belief systems that have started to take over and result in the loss of culture and the loss of ancient belief systems. Now, that's really unfortunate, because at the end of the day, if I consider from my sort of perspective, from a Westerner's perspective, you have these monotheistic systems that originated or dominated in the Western world several hundred years ago. And nowadays, in a spiritual context, we are going back away from monotheistic practices and going and returning to more ancient practices of animistic beliefs, understanding that we connect to the earth energy and that we can draw energy from it and it can heal us. And we also are going into a version of not necessarily ancestor worship, but recognizing the fact that our ancestors play a role in our lives. So a lot of healing and a lot of mediums and clairvoyance are, in a Western context, helping people to realize the impact that their ancestors have had in their life. Now, this is several hundred years after the dominance of monotheistic beliefs. And Africa, in many senses, are almost in the beginnings of this transitional period where monotheism is taking root. And to the cultural identity and the absolute beauty that is African belief systems. You know, we're losing so much cultural identity and ancient religious and spiritual practices across the African continent because of the dominance of this monotheistic belief system. And I find it incredibly sad, because I fear that by the time Africa goes through this cycle of realizing truth in their own systems of belief, in their own cultural identity, that perhaps this knowledge will be lost forever, which is much the case in the Western context. You know, we had a lot of ancient belief systems across Europe, whether it was forms of paganism or, you know, the Druid practices, and all of these things were overtaken by monotheism. And I'm not too sure that monotheism is for Africa. I think African belief systems and African understanding of spirituality and consciousness in itself is substantially more advanced than the simplistic church-driven monotheistic practices. And I find it sad. I wish I could warn people that we can still be modern without losing our African heritage. And I wish people would realize that scientific evidence, no matter what we believe, science is proving and showing to us that all of our ancestors came out of Africa, and that there is nothing inferior about Africa. Africa is an amazing place. It has amazing cultural beliefs. It has diversity. It has spiritual consciousness. And I hope that in the future that we will all begin to realize that there is only one species. You know, it doesn't make a difference what color of skin you have or what language you speak. We are all Africans. Our species, our genus, all originated in Africa. And I hope that we start utilizing and learning more about the intense spiritual beliefs and consciousness of Africans and their cultural systems. And that is why I'm glad that this conference is taking place, because I think it has the opportunity of bringing hundreds of people together and very critical spiritual leaders across Africa. Because although I'm white, although I'm not a Black African, I was born in Africa, I lived in Africa, and I will not go anywhere. My soul and my heart is in Africa. And we just need to embrace each other, irrespective of our skin color, irrespective of our language that we speak. We need to embrace each other as fellow Africans, as fellow conscious beings, and not seek systems outside of Africa to pacify our desire for consciousness. you know, we need to embrace African beliefs and African traditions, because by embracing African beliefs and African traditions, we are going to ignite a fire within ourselves that will push this energy forward across the world. And I just think, you know, Africa is a beautiful place. I've studied African history and art and for many decades, and I'm the whitest African in the world. And I'm going to finish with a small story. I was at a university and I was helping one of my professors talk about origins and talk about a single sort of species, and that we are all Africans and that we all originated in Africa. And I can remember saying distinctively in the lecture, you know, I'm an African. And there were some African guys that got upset with me, and they were absolutely disgusted by the fact that I was a white person claiming heritage in Africa. And I just simply said to the students, I said, well, look, you know, maybe you've missed the point of my lecture, but everybody is African, and it's irrespective of our skin color. And I said, you know, I was born in Africa. I live in Africa. My children were born in Africa. If I'm not African, what am I? And thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. I hope that this conference proceeds in the future with great enthusiasm. And it's been an absolute honor and a blessing to have this opportunity.